This is the Miller Philosopher. So before I get started, I want to put this out there right now, that this video will not touch on real world issues at all. There's going to be no references to that, except the exception of a Tolkien reference, which will come later, and that is only once. Having said that, this video will be strictly dealing with this topic within the fictional world of Middle-earth. So with that out of the way, one of the things that Numenor was known for was that it allowed for women to rule as queens. And this is because not only does the Silmarillion and the Second Age delve in depth into this, but that all Tolkien lore junkies know that this was a key point to Aragorn's rise to the long unoccupied throne of Gondor, because one of his ancestors, Firiel, was a Gondorian princess and the only surviving child of the dead Gondorian king, Andohir, and that this was also the key linchpin in her Arnorian husband's plan, Arduvui, to somehow claim the throne of Gondor and what was left of Arnor, so as to strengthen his position against the Witch King of Angmar. And, as we all know, the Gondorian Council at the time rejected this claim, putting instead a distant cousin of the king's on the throne. However, for me, the real question was, why? And not only for Gondor, but why did the Dunedain kingdoms of post-Numenor not follow their ancestors' traditions of following the eldest or surviving daughters and put them on the throne? Now, officially, Tolkien never goes into the specifics of why the Dunedain made this unspoken change, like he does with the Numenorian rulers. So, everything I've said and will say here on is strictly speculation. At first, it could be argued that the eldest were always sons, and so it wasn't really an issue. However, then I came across a Tumblr post that claims that Anarion, the younger brother of Isildur, had 3 elder daughters, and that it was his 4th child, Melendil, who was chosen to become the next king of Gondor after the death of Isildur, his uncle. I've looked to try to confirm if the other 3 children were girls or not, and the only thing I was able to confirm in my search, at least from mine anyway, was that Melendil was the 4th child of Anarion, and that it doesn't say what sex the other children were. So, let's be honest, it's entirely possible that the Tumblr post was an assumption. More into that later. But all that being said, this does mean that regardless, the elder 3 children were passed over for the younger. It's fascinating. And given Gondor's well-documented preferences for male rulers, the idea that Anarion's first 3 children were girls tends to hold a lot of weight with me. Arnor and its 3 successor substates post-division also, though, seems to follow this pattern. And even then, the remote possibility of a woman on a Dunedain throne only comes up through the thousands of years of history of both kingdoms during the Andohir succession crisis. And even this presents some uncomfortable truth about the Dunedain as well, because, as I said, Firiel was the only surviving child of Andohir. Therefore, she, under later Numenorian law at least, should have been the next ruler of Gondor, if Gondor was truly following their ancestors' traditions, as they often claimed, not her husband, who was heir to the throne of Arthedain. Unless he also would like to claim that Arthedain was the spiritual successor of Arnor, and that it was ruled by the High Kings of both kingdoms, Elendil and, briefly, Isildur. So, again, kind of another loophole there, if you decided to take that route. Now, a popular theory that I do find myself kind of siding with is that the reason for this change was just the times that the Dunedain kingdoms came to be in. That during the time of the ruling queens of Numenor, the empire had mostly been at a state of peace, unlike the Dunedain, who had migrated to a hostile and always potentially hostile land during the latter half of the Second Age. and it was expected that during wartime, a man was supposed to lead the armies into war, High Queen or not. So, therefore, it's entirely possible that both kingdoms, regardless of their Numenorean heritage, held the view that women do not fight or lead wars. Nice job ignoring Haleth there of the Halidin. I think she would like a word with you. Anyways, because of these uncertain times, even after Sauron's third fall/defeat, it only makes sense that the male child of the king would take up the throne. And this is where the idea of Anarion having 3 elder daughters gains some traction, since no reason is given for the children being overlooked like what Tolkien usually does during dynastic disputes. It is also reasonable to assume that any unknown mentions of elder daughters in both kingdoms falls to the wayside because of the nature of Middle-earth itself, and that in a worst case scenario, should the king and his sons die, usually the sons had already had children, or there was some distant cousin or someone who was next in line to fill in the seat should the line fail or be in danger of failing. And that's what made the situation of Ondahir so unique in Dunedain history, because essentially that backup wasn't there, or at the very least was extremely tenuous. The Gondor Council only started looking for another relative after Arduvwy made the proposal and put forth the Numenorian claim as well. It was only then that they started looking for somebody else who was at least somewhere in a bloodline that they can put in the seat instead. After all, Ondahir and all his male line, as far as they knew, his sons, were dead, and his sons had no children. So now Gondor found itself in this situation that they have a legitimate claimant to the throne, but at the same time, that claimant went against established precedent. And for the record, precedent is that it is something that is not written necessarily, but follows a common pattern that is the next best thing to law. And it was nearly a flawless out for Gondor had Arduvwy not brought up that little loophole of the Numenorian queens. And this is why this little spoken aspect of Dunedain culture now exploded onto the main stage. And to be sure, it is also fair to assume that Arduvwy didn't really care about the ancient heritage of their peoples either, and was more concerned about political leverage to get the power and resources of Gondor, and thus avail his kingdom of that power to get out of trouble with Angmar. It is also worth noting that Gondor was almost always in a state of war or readiness for it. It was a very militant kingdom, so the precedent held more practical weight, and I'm sure went a ways to convincing the council to essentially ignore their ancestors' law. It simply wasn't practical, and Numenor was long gone, and despite how much trouble this had gotten them into, Gondor was still wary of intermarrying with foreigners into their culture. Shout out to the kinstrife there, because rest assured, they did consider their distant cousins foreigners. Arnor and Gondor were 2 specifically different cultures. So, I think the reason why the Dunedain chose not to follow their cherished Numenorian heritage was because in their eyes it simply wasn't practical for the realities of living in Middle-earth. There may be some sexism at play over the roles of women, but it's also a medieval-like world where biology and community does play an extremely important role in the survival of the kingdom/community's survival, short of extreme circumstances. And, as a side note, this is also probably what made Eowyn's situation so unique, as her actions at Minas Tirith in Return of the King flew right in the face of these cultural perceptions, though it was because she wanted to go out on her own terms rather than due to heartbreak or anything of trying to assert her dominance, as it were. But having said all that, let me know what your guys' thoughts are in the comments below, and this is the Miller Philosopher. You guys have a good day.